Michelle Jensen. Do we have Michelle Jensen? Okay, Kathy Sutter.
Present.
Deanna Zentner.
Present.
Joyce Tilkowski.
Here.
Joyce Tilkowski here. Andrew Hoyos.
He's absent today.
Okay. Shelby Christie was replaced.
Yep. That spot won't be here today either.
Okay. James Danke.
Here.
Thank you. Peter Wheel.
Here.
Todd Violante.
Here.
Renee Lauber.
Here.
Bob Whipperforth.
Here.
And that, thank you.
And Michelle Jensen is here also now. Great. Thank you so much, Sharon, for going through that. We do have a quorum and almost everybody here this first time, so that's terrific. We'll move to item B in our agenda, election of officers. The first one would be election of a chair, and so I'll take any nominations for the chair.
I nominate Supervisor Melissa Radcliffe as chair.
Thank you, Supervisor McGinnity. Any other nominations? Any other nominations? Per Robert's rules, I have to say it 3 times just so you're all aware. Are there any other nominations for chair?
Madam Chair, I move to close nominations and cast unanimous ballot for Melissa Radcliffe.
Thank you, Supervisor Ripp. Then the nomination, well, so you threw a loop at me there, Supervisor Ripp. Do you need a second on that?
Should, yes.
I'll second.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, President Whipperforth. Then if there is no objection, that will be noted as having passed unanimously. And we will then move on to election of vice chair.
I'd like to nominate Kate McGinnity.
Thank you, Supervisor Ripp. Are there any further nominations for vice chair? Any nominations for vice chair? Any further nominations for vice chair? All right, seeing no further nominations for vice chair, then if there is no objection, since Supervisor Ripp, since you made a motion previously, do you need one on the vice chair as well?
It's cleaner if we do. I just didn't make it because I made the original motion to nominate.
Okay.
I'd move to close nominations and cast unanimous ballot for Kate McGinnity as vice chair.
Thank you, Supervisor Ripp. Is there a second on that motion?
I'll second it.
Thank you. Who was that? James Danke?
Yes, it was.
Great. Thank you so much. Then if there is no objection, that will be noted as Supervisor Kate McGinnity as being vice chair of our task force. Thank you so much, everybody. Then that brings us to, I just want to have a few housekeeping topics then, since we are virtual. There are little reminders and instructions. This meeting is being recorded. As we continue to hold meetings remotely, that necessitates procedures that recognize the limitations of our technology. So please stay muted when not speaking. If you do have a question or comment, if you can note it in the chat box. I hope everybody has access to the chat box and can find it. I have it in the upper right-hand corner of my screen. And if you just put a question mark or like write comment in the chat box, then I will be able to recognize you in the order in which it's in the box. The chat box is a public record, so only official business should be in the box. There may be lengthy pauses during the meeting in order to allow ample opportunity for members to enter information into the chat box if there are questions or comments. But we'll try to limit that. And lastly, given the nature of virtual meetings, internet difficulties can be a common occurrence. And so as a result, if I happen to have technical difficulties, the vice chair, Supervisor McGinnity, may assume the role of chair until I'm able to return. So we have a backup, so to speak. If we do have testimony on any items, that person will have 3 minutes to speak, and staff will promote them to speak to us. And I think, well, for staff on the call with us today is Lauren Kuhl, who I'm sure you've all gotten emails from. She's with the County Board Office. Sharon Lesberg is with UW Extension and is helping to facilitate the meeting and get presenters and do all the background work, and she's here with us today. Additionally, we have Josh Schrader, who's with the County Board Office, and Majid Allen, who is with Dane County Planning. And so is there, Lauren or Sharon, do we have any registrants this afternoon?
There's one registrant for public comment on items not on the agenda.
Okay, so when we get to that point, then we'll note that. Thank you. So that then brings us to item C, consideration of the minutes, which there are none today. D, action items, none. E, no specific presentations, but item F, reports to committee. So we'll do introductions, and when I call on you, please state your name and the position you represent on this task force. Just say your name and like the position if you can, kind of keep it limited. We'll have more time to discuss what brought you to be interested in this task force later in the meeting. So I'll go first. I'm Melissa Ratcliffe. I'm County Board Supervisor of District 36. That includes the village of Cottage Grove, the town of Cottage Grove, and the town of Pleasant Springs. I'm also a representative from the Public Works and Transportation Committee. And I'll call on Supervisor Kate McGinnity next.
Hi, everybody. I am Supervisor Kate McGinnity for District 37, which is on the far eastern and southeastern edges of Dane County. And I am also on the UW Extension Committee.
Thank you, Supervisor McGinnity. Next, Supervisor David Ripp.
Yeah, I'm Dave Ripp. I'm a county supervisor and I represent the northwest corner up here. Basically, I border Sauk County, Columbia County, come down to Madison. I got that whole rural area there. I'm on Public Works Committee and Extension.
Thank you, Supervisor Ripp. Bill Dickmeyer.
Yes, Bill Dickmeyer. I'm the Regional Service Manager for IT at Unity Point Health Meriter Hospital, and I'm the IT Healthcare Representative on this committee.
Thank you, Bill. Michelle Jensen.
Hi, Michelle Jensen, Deerfield School Superintendent. Deerfield is on the far east side of the county, and I represent the school district administrators for Dane County. There are 16 public schools fully within the county.
Thank you, Michelle. Kathy Sutter. Oh, you're muted. There you go.
I represent an economic and/or agricultural interest. I from Blue Mounds Township. I serve on a board of directors for a telecommunications company and live on a large farm.
Thank you, Kathy. Deanna Zentner.
Hi, I'm Dina Zentner, and I am the chairperson in the town of Rutland, representing 2012 residents. And the town of Rutland is sandwiched in between Oregon and Stoughton.
Thank you, Dina. Sorry for mispronouncing your name. Next, Joyce Tukulski, if I said that right.
Yeah, you did very well. I'm here today as a representative of a senior center. It's Stoughton area senior center. So it includes the city of Stoughton plus an extended area that follows the school district boundaries.
Great. Thank you, Joyce. Andrew Hoyos is not here this afternoon, but he's with Hoyos Consulting and represents the internet broadband provider. And we don't have the representative from the Boys and Girls Club of Dane County. So, but I think hopefully we'll have somebody next time that represents a youth community-based organization. James Danke.
James Danke, resident of the town of Dunkirk.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's fine.
Okay, sorry. Peter Wheel.
Hi, my name's Peter Weil. I'm a resident of the town of Black Earth, member of the Black Earth Plan Commission, and I also work as a web developer at UW-Madison.
Great, thank you, Peter. Sorry about mispronouncing your last name. And Todd Violante.
Hello, I'm Todd Violante. I'm the director of the Dane County Planning and Development Department, and I'm representing the county executive.
Thank you, Todd. And I will get your name right one of these days too. Renee Lauber.
Hi, Renee Lauber. I am the executive director of the Dane County Towns Association, representing the 33 towns in Dane County. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Renee. And lastly, Bob Whipperforth.
Bob Whipperforth, I'm the president of the Village of Windsor, but I'm here today representing the Dane County Cities and Villages Association, for which I serve as president of that organization.
Great, thanks, Bob. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We have quite the guest or member list, so thank you all. Next, that will bring us to discussion of the charge and anticipated outcome, and I'll turn it over to Supervisor McGinnity to go through that.
Thank you, Chair Radcliffe, and I add my greetings, welcome, and thank you to each of you for agreeing to join this task force and to work together to resolve the digital divide for our residents of Dane County. As Chair Radcliffe and I dug into this topic over the last 14 to 16 months or so, it led us to understand the problems unique to Dane County in regards to broadband expansion. 2020 Resolution 415 reflects our understanding of how to most expediently address our unique issues and was the basis of formulating this task force. 2020 Res 415 states our purpose and goals in a formal way. In simple words, the intent of this task force is to partner with our Dane County municipalities in applying for available state and federal grants, to assist them in the lift of understanding what grants are available when, what the qualifications are for each grant, and helping them in gathering the necessary data to apply for the grants. We are hoping to locate and/or assist in creating more accurate maps of who does and who doesn't have internet and why. Current Dane County maps indicate a high coverage percentage due to Madison. However, from what we hear from our Dane County residents, we know there are pockets without any service available and areas where the speeds or reliability are unacceptable for the internet needs of given businesses and families. As Dr. Tessa Conway noted in the introductory webinar, relationships with internet service providers are a vital aspect of this process. This task force will assist in connecting Dane County communities with internet service providers with whom they can cultivate partnerships and future collaborations. Additionally, this task force will make recommendations to the county board regarding broadband expansion and will also explore alternative technologies that may be the best fit for some areas of our county. Finally, we hope to create a system of municipality support that will be sustainable, extending beyond the life of this task force until the point in time that broadband, like water and electricity, is a public utility. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor McGinnity. Did anyone have any comments or questions on that before we turn it over to Dr. Conroy? If you can just note it in the chat box, and if not, then we will move on to item broadband introduction by Tessa Conroy with UW Extension. So I will turn it over to you, Dr. Conroy.
All right. Thank you. And thanks for having me this afternoon. I'm glad to be here chatting with all of you during your first meeting. So what I hope I can offer today is an overview of broadband. I expect with this audience, a lot of what I'll be talking about is familiar. If there are places where I can speed up or slow down and answer some questions, I'm happy to do that. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, but perhaps you could help me by just interrupting if you do have a question, and that works just fine for me. So with that, I'll try to get my slides here going. All right, can I get a thumbs up? Are we seeing my slides? All right, thank you. So this comes from some products that you might have seen from UW Extension. So we had been thinking about broadband for quite some time, even before the pandemic, but with the pandemic happening, we really called all hands on deck and decided to dig into the issue. And what came from that was a series of products, a data-driven report, a policy brief, and then a series of fact sheets that summarize those highlights. So we have those available to you online if any of you would like to dig into the details. And I just want to nod to my co-authors and colleagues on this project, working with a fellow economist, Dr. Steve Deller. We had a geographer who was really helpful in getting us these census tract level maps and helping us understand the FCC and census data. Dr. Sarah Lowe's at the University of Missouri, but she comes from the USDA. She had a role at the federal level in the Reconnect program. So getting that perspective. Jeff Glazer is a lawyer who helped us understand some of the statutory limitations in Wisconsin. And then two educators, specialists actually, and an educator who have helped us really understand what this looks like for community. So I am proud of the team that we had come together on this. So with that, the brief overview. As I said, broadband was a challenge before the pandemic. I think we all knew that. 14% of households do not have a broadband subscription in Wisconsin. Dane County is lower than that, and I'll talk about some of those specifics. But even before the pandemic, we were understanding that broadband is much more than a modern amenity. There are still some audiences, I think, that view broadband as, you know, a way to watch movies online or do shopping online, that it's kind of an amenity. But I think more and more we're coming to understand, and some people fully appreciate broadband as part of access to healthcare, as part of education, as part of getting healthcare, education, schooling. And so with the pandemic, these challenges of getting education, of going to work, of accessing healthcare only became more acute. And it was really hard to adjust for those without it. So the pandemic really helped us understand the economic costs of going without, that this isn't an amenity, that there are real economic costs of going without broadband for communities. I think for me, one of the takeaway messages about broadband was a better understanding of the disparities. So there are still significant shares of the population without internet, and I had mostly heard about the disparities in terms of a rural-urban divide. And what I think the report makes clear is that, yes, we have a rural-urban divide when it comes to access to broadband internet, but actually the income level disparities are even more acute, even larger than are the rural-urban gaps. And I think that looking at these two disparities can help us understand broadband, or the challenges with broadband, in two ways. So when we're thinking about rural-urban disparities, often those have to do with addressing the supply of broadband. So these tend to be infrastructure challenges. That's what's getting in the way of some of our rural audiences not having access. But when we look at income level disparities, that often has more to do with addressing demand. So affordability, willingness to pay. For some audiences, there's still a role for demonstrating relevance of broadband. and a need for digital literacy. So it's not just infrastructure, it's infrastructure and education and price and digital literacy. So one of the outcomes that we hope comes from this report is that as communities are thinking about broadband and expanding access, yes, we're thinking about infrastructure, but the plans also include thinking about adoption, thinking about affordability. So here's a way to visualize the disparity. What I have for you is a chart with the breakdown of counties by rurality. So at the very top, I have the most rural communities, and at the very bottom are the most urban communities. Dane County is in the second tier from the bottom for reference. And then within each level of rurality, we look at things by income. So let's go down to the bottom. In the most urban counties, you see that for people in the lowest income tier, that's where the largest section are going without service. So upwards of 45% without internet access. Whereas when we look at the highest income tier in urban counties, so that 75,000 or greater, we have well under 10% going without internet. If we look at, let's look at that lowest income tier, so the red bar. As we become more and more rural, it's true that there is a disparity, right? So as we become more rural, at any given income level, generally we're seeing more people go without service. But what I think the takeaway here is, yes, we see those rural or urban divides, so less access in more rural settings, but within any given geography, the gaps between income level are actually larger than between any given level of geography. So income, geography, we have two ways of thinking about the disparity. I think this graphic helps us understand that income is actually quite severe when it comes to understanding the gaps. So this map is another way of visualizing disparities. And there are sort of two things to think about with this graph, or with this map, excuse me. One is who has access, and the other is who is adopting. So I'm going to go ahead and skip to Dane County because I think that that's better. So if we're looking at Dane County, I want to draw your attention to the light gray section of Dane County. What that's telling us is that these are sections of the county where 10% or more are without access. So that means the FCC has said these are places where at least 10% of the population is going without service due to infrastructure. So infrastructure, addressing supply, that's clearly a problem in Dane County. But I also want to draw your attention to these smaller, very dark gray, they look dark gray to me, sections of the county, kind of here near the lakes and somewhat down here in the southeast corner. These sections are perhaps most interesting to me because these are sections where the FCC says these places have service, but households aren't adopting. We have relatively high shares of the population going without service. So that's interesting. If the FCC says there is service, and yet we have a lot of households that aren't subscribing, what's going on there? There are a couple possible explanations. So one is that the data is wrong, that the FCC is saying that these places have service, but they don't actually. And I think from anecdote, from community surveys, we know that that is a common problem, that the FCC data is imperfect. And many households are going out without service, even though the data might suggest that they do. The second is affordability, that yes, they have service, but it's not at a price point that is accessible. And you see this too, a lot of these dark gray areas show up in Milwaukee County and some of the less wealthy parts of the county. So again, raising questions about affordability, for example. And then I think the other component of adoption is demand. It could be that people have access and they can afford it, but there might still be subsets of the population for whom digital literacy is a barrier or for whom they don't see the relevance. And so again, education might be a part of understanding the relatively low subscription rates in these sort of dark gray pockets of Dane County.
Dr. Conroy, I just wanted to know if there was a comment in the chat box about please confirm internet is not the same as broadband, or is it, or?
So that's a great question. In this case, when I mentioned these sort of light gray areas that are going without broadband, that is the definition of broadband as the FCC gives it. So the kind of 25.3 definition. When I say internet, I am referring to internet, and that's because in the census survey, when they're asking households, do you have internet? They're just sort of relying on their own interpretation of what internet is. So it might be broadband, but it's not necessarily. The question is about internet.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So how did we even get here in the first place? How did we even get to this current state of affairs where we have segments of the population without broadband? And there are a lot of answers to that question, and I'm going to go through a couple here. So I think the first answer to how did we get here is a story about low return on investment for providers. So infrastructure is expensive to build, and that can be just because of the nature of building it. You're digging underground, or you're going perhaps in an urban area through concrete and cement. That can be quite expensive. It might require particular expertise. Some of the terrain in Wisconsin is not hospitable to internet up and down, lots of geographical obstructions. This can make it quite expensive as well, or add to cost. That, combined with providers, are going to be weighing that cost against their potential customers, their potential revenue stream. So in a low density area, the cost weighed against the number of consumers is unfavorable. And that's combined with the take rate. So if in a rural area, not only do you have low density, but you anticipate a low take rate. Maybe you have an older demographic, for example, or a less educated demographic. These are two groups that tend to have lower adoption rates. If the take rate isn't going to be high among the already thin number of people, for a provider to make that investment just may not make sense. So that low return on investment can get in the way of broadband reaching all geographies and all households. There have been a number of grants and initiatives. We've seen these at the federal level. We've seen these at the state level. And so I think it's natural to ask, if we've had all of these programs and all of these investment, why do we still have people without access? And again, I think it's the nature of the grants and initiatives. So the first challenge of these grants and initiatives, maybe working as well as they could, are the data limitations. So oftentimes, to qualify or apply for these grants, you would need to demonstrate need. You would use the FCC data most likely to do that. But as I discussed just a minute ago, the FCC data it's generally well known that it overstates coverage. So you might go to look at the map provided by the FCC and it says that your town or neighborhood is covered, even though when you knock on doors, you know that it is not. So we have sort of an imperfect data source that people are having to rely on. The problem here is that it's collected from providers, and they report whether they can or do provide service within a census block. And if at least one location in the block is served, they can answer, yes, we cover this service block. So even if only one house has service, on the map, it's going to look as though that whole region has coverage. It's also based on advertised speeds. So for a provider, they could say, yes, I can provide speeds up to the definition of broadband, even though in practicality, the speeds that most households are accessing are not as high as this advertised speed. So that can also overstate coverage. We hope to see some of these challenges resolved. March of last year, under the Trump administration, the Data Act was passed. That's meant to address a lot of these limitations. With some of the stimulus bills, that Data Act actually got some dollars behind it. So now I actually anticipate seeing those wheels start to turn. Unfortunately, I know a few people in DC have tried to ask. Nobody has any sense of when this might actually happen. I anticipate that it could be still years before we see these improved maps. So some additional challenges to why these maybe grants and initiatives haven't gotten us as far as we'd hope. It's not just about the FCC data. Many communities are going to find that they need not just not just the FCC data, but they're going to need information about nearby providers. If you don't have service, it might be the natural first step to think about, well, who's close? And for those providers, it might make the most sense to build out. So having information about nearby providers might be necessary for establishing a reasonable partnership. You might need information about existing infrastructure. Who owns that tower? You might need to know who owns that piece of land, and so on. And so bringing all of these pieces together, we've definitely interacted with communities that don't even have the GIS files that they might need to form a plan. So all of these pieces have to come together. It can be quite cumbersome for a community that's getting started thinking about broadband. It can be limited to specific types of entities. So it might require a partnership. It might require that it be a public entity. So it's not just anybody that can apply. So this could be another reason we don't see those grants initiatives going further. Requires quite a bit of technical expertise. You know, several years ago when I got started doing research on broadband, I didn't know what I didn't know. I definitely underestimated how much technical expertise I would have to gain before I would really be well versed in broadband. So I think that is a challenge. Thinking about financing and bonding and how are we going to make the money work, that's also, you know, a particular skill set that communities have to pull together potentially to apply for these grants, so it can make it quite difficult. We do have the Broadband Connectors pilot in Wisconsin. Some of you might be familiar. I would suggest connecting with the PSC if you aren't familiar. WEDC, this was a partnership with these two entities meant to get communities some of the technical assistance that they might need to move on broadband. So a couple more answers to this kind of how did we get here? So we have low return on investment. We have the challenges of grants and initiatives. Another answer to the question has to do with municipal barriers. So Wisconsin is one of about half of states in the country that have statutory limitations on providing broadband. So this means there are limitations to either municipal or cooperatives providing broadband. In Wisconsin, we actually have a pretty robust cooperative provision of broadband. I think there are 11 cooperatives providing broadband in Wisconsin. What we do have, however, are limitations on municipal broadband. So it makes it quite difficult for a town, a city to get in the game of providing broadband. And recent research, just a paper last year by my colleagues at Oklahoma State and Purdue, they found that these limitations do in fact explain why some places have less service. So it does seem to be the case that these laws that were perhaps made in the spirit of protecting competition between providers are amounting to less service, kind of state by state. So as I mentioned, the cooperatives have done well in Wisconsin. I think that this model has a lot of advantages. Cooperatives are not a profit maximizing organization in the way that some providers are, so there appear to be cost advantages in some cases. Also, cooperatives often already have expertise in infrastructure, in service provision, so it makes sense for these entities to be involved in providing broadband if they can find a way. Another answer here is just the amount of investment that it might take. So here we're looking at the federal cost of infrastructure for analogous investments. So electrification, the highway system, and then you see broadband. The telephone system isn't an appropriate comparison. I just have a note in there about why. But what you see is that for electricity, for the highway system, and especially electricity, actually dwarf the broadband investment. So it could be the case that, yes, we've certainly seen billions of dollars go to broadband. That is a lot of money. I'm not trying to take away from those investments, but it just might take a really huge investment to truly reach everybody in the way that some of our services or another utility has. So those are some of the answers as to how we got here and kind of understanding the current situation. And I just want to make clear the costs. And this is based on our sort of community economic well-being perspective. So the first thing we find is that going without broadband is associated with lower population growth and lower employment growth. So it points to preferences for places with broadband. A colleague of mine has done research showing that houses without broadband have lower selling values. So it's sort of this revealed preference. It does seem to be the case that people are willing to pay for broadband. They want it. They move to those areas where they can get it. And I think that that's really important, especially when we're talking about the potential for COVID era shifts in telecommuting. If workers are now less anchored to their places of employment, I think this could be a story of rural renaissance, that if people can move where they want, they might choose to live in relatively rural areas, but I think they're still going to want to have broadband. So those places, those rural places with service would have an advantage in capturing some of that migration. Entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship, this is what I think most about at work, and how do we make entrepreneurial places? I think about that because entrepreneurs are connected to job creation, they're connected to economic stability, they're connected to income growth and poverty alleviation, lots of benefits. So if we can figure out how to support entrepreneurs, we can perhaps figure out how to have a more robust economy. And broadband is part of that story. So there's much more startup activity in places with greater access. We see this too equitably across different types of entrepreneurs. So sometimes entrepreneurship programs might favor a high growth entrepreneur or a tech entrepreneur or a certain, maybe even programs are often centered in urban areas. Broadband is good for businesses of all types, for different types of owners. It's especially good for remote rural entrepreneurs. So when we think about equitably enhancing entrepreneurship, I think broadband has a lot of merit. Education, broadband is connected to education outcomes at all levels, third grade reading scores, at the high school level, ACT scores, and then the share of the population with some college as well. This McKinsey & Company sort of snapshot I'm showing you is a bit provocative, but I do think it's useful to think about broadband in terms of the connection to education as a cohort. So if we have entire cohorts of people that are with less access to broadband, and that has implications for their access to education, you have chunks of the population that are less skilled than they might otherwise be. And that's about workforce development. So I think if we think about this on a broader scale, broadband is really important in that way. And here's just showing that positive correlation. So each dot is a county. A higher value of the broadband index on the x-axis implies higher access. And then you see the percent of the population with some college increasing, you get that nice positive relationship. And then also cost to health. So better health outcomes in places with greater access. So we have fewer people reporting poor or fair health, also fewer poor mental health days. And I've been engaging with public health colleagues to talk about broadband as a super determinant of health. So the idea here is that actually a very small amount of our health is connected to the experience that we have with our care provider. A lot of our health has to do with our socioeconomic circumstances. So do we have a safe house? Do we have safe and reliable employment? Do we have access to nutritious food? And broadband kind of underlies all of these socioeconomic factors that feed into our health, our ability to get education, our ability to seek employment, even especially during COVID, our ability to get our groceries and healthy food. So thinking about broadband in terms of, you know, a kind of systems approach that it's connected to all of these other things is also important. So with these last few minutes here, I just want to pivot. Okay, so we got a little bit of the lay of the land in Dane County, why, how we got here, what are the costs. So now sort of what do we do about it, what's out there? So with addressing broadband access, so this is sort of addressing that supply side and infrastructure. Two things that I expect this group is familiar with, so I won't spend a lot of time, but we do have our state broadband program coming out of the Public Service Commission. They're communicating, they're planning, coordinating across entities, working on data management and improvement. So these maps that I mentioned, part of their charge would be, you know, making what data they have available and thinking through those limitations, also grant administration. Funding. There are 57 federal programs. I can send you to a link with the library of those federal programs, but we also have state level grants and loans. There are tax incentives, bonds, specific purpose funds at the state level, philanthropy. You might have heard of Minnesota's program. They have a very active philanthropist that has helped them with broadband. So again, I don't want to spend a ton of time on any one example, but our policy brief does have examples of states handling funding in a lot of different ways to think through localities that have financed things in different ways. So that might be a good reference. Another thing to think about in addressing access is alternative providers and local provision. So as I mentioned, in Wisconsin, we have limited traction with what a municipality can do due to state statute, but we do have robust cooperatives. So partnering with a cooperative in terms of expanding access has been a successful path for some communities in Wisconsin. I also like to highlight anchor institutions. Schools, libraries, hospitals can all be really great partners in expanding access. As a separate example, in Kansas City, there was a utility that said, we need to update all of our infrastructure. So we're going to update our infrastructure, but when we're done, we're going to have excess capacity. And they leased that excess capacity to providers to then administer broadband service. So it became a really great partnership of a utility working with providers, working with the city to get service. Hospitals have also their examples of hospitals banding together and saying, we're going to invest in infrastructure, partly because we need it, partly because it's part of serving the health of our constituency. And we're going to lease to providers so that we can get service to all of our patients or all of our communities. Schools often doing hotspots. We're seeing a lot of this already. Libraries casting a much larger signal than they might need if they were just doing their building so that people from the nearby park, from the parking lot could access broadband. So some of these anchor institutions really do have a role. In Oklahoma, I believe it's a library system that's doing they're lending out hotspots, just like a library book, basically. So there are different ways of expanding access by partnering with anchor institutions. And then, so in addition to access, thinking about broadband adoption. So in general, non-metro, so we could think of, non-metro is a very generous term for rural. So places that we might not picture as rural would be still included in this definition. So probably outside, like Madison proper might still be rural in this definition, but in these areas, adoption rates tend to lag by 12 to 13 percentage points pretty consistently. And what this research paper that I'm citing finds is that this is mostly actually due to demographic characteristics rather than a lack of infrastructure. So it's not that people don't have access. That's not why they're not signing up. It has to do with lower income, education attainment, older population. These are all segments that are larger in rural areas and are associated with lower adoption rates. So what that points to is perhaps a lower willingness to pay. So that price point, if we want people to adopt in some rural areas, might need to be lower in order to onboard these audiences. And that's due to kind of a lower valuation of the service. It can be affordability challenges that, if incomes are lower, we're just not able to pay as high a price for service. There's less prevalent computer ownership across some of these segments as well. So if you don't have the device, it might be less worth it to you to pay for service. So again, in terms of expanding access, affordability, education, even providing devices in some case might be part of the equation. And then digital literacy gaps, making sure people, perhaps the reason some might not sign up because they just don't know, what they would do with it. And so digital literacy might be part of it, or they would be uncomfortable with the challenges, those sorts of things. So addressing that. So far, less than 1/4 of federal spending on rural expansion has gone towards affordability and adoption. So I think that there's actually quite a bit of space here to move the dial. It's also important for attracting investment. And this goes back to the take rate. If a provider is considering a rural area and they anticipate a low take rate, that people are unable to afford it or simply don't see the need for it in their home, it becomes even harder for them to justify making the investment. So if you can increase adoption, so you have a thin rural area, but 100% of people say they want service, now that might start to make a bit more sense for a provider. So thinking about that demand side is often part of the equation. Affordability, could we think about assistance for households who could utilize programs, a subsidy? Are there ways, if we can keep the cost of infrastructure down, so some grants and initiatives, the goal is to make it more, make it feasible to build infrastructure. Are there ways to forward those savings onto customers rather than just benefit the provider? So thinking about the way we structure incentive programs and grants and initiatives, I think also matters. As I mentioned, cooperatives offer an alternative model in that rather than profit maximization, which could drive a higher price, most cooperatives in their mission have something along the lines of just providing service to their members. So that might mean a lower price point and lead to different pricing structures from a cooperative. And then, addressing these preferences, value and willingness to pay, digital literacy, which I already mentioned. So these are just a couple of nuggets I would say we came across in learning about examples, talking with communities that helped places be successful. One is leadership. It's really important, we saw, for there to be a person, team, or organization who is the champion for broadband. That is really the engine behind making something happen. Somebody has to take the reins, or an entity, could be a group of people. Technical assistance. The more we can do to get communities, people, the technical assistance they need, that has been lent itself to success. Partnership with cooperatives, anchor institutions, and providers is essential oftentimes. And even partnering with other regions can be really important. So if you have a rural region and they can partner with a neighboring rural region, all of a sudden together there might be sufficient demand to attract a provider. And so coordinating those efforts with the region, and maybe in one community they're low on the technical expertise, but they can lean on someone or a group in another region, vice versa. Somebody has financing figured out. So combining expertise and forming those alliances can be really important. And then data alternatives. This is something where Extension has tried to be helpful. We've asked communities that have done surveys to share whatever surveys they have done with us. There are ways to do speed tests. M Labs is an online company where you can kind of, they're building their own map basically from your phone, from your computer. You would upload your serviceability, and then they're populating a map with all of that crowdsourced information, and it can serve as an alternative to the FCC data. And some people will accept that as an alternative. So that is another component that could lead to success. Often a first step for many communities is figuring out how to overcome those data limitations. So I hope I've been helpful. I'm happy to stay and answer a few questions and chat with you all. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was a lot of information. But a lot of it's unfortunate that it was things that we had run across, Supervisor McGinnity and myself, and I'm sure a lot of other people on our task force, knowing that there is a divide and that it needs to be addressed. And that's why we're all here working to partner together to try to help our county and communities. So if there are any questions for Dr. Conroy, if you can please note something in the chat box and I'll call on you. I see James Danke had something in the chat. If you want to speak to that, James.
Thank you. If you can see the chat box, it's got it's just got a question, because I can't. I was watching them dig today right in front of our farm to put natural gas there, and I kept thinking, I don't understand how come you can't run a fiber optic cable in the same trench or whatever. So I have no idea if it is prohibited, and then why is it? I don't know. I can't imagine that's going to set off the natural gas.
I unfortunately don't know of a limitation. That certainly doesn't mean there isn't one, unless it's cost prohibitive for them. But in terms of a legal limitation, nothing comes to mind. But to me, that's kind of a potential partnership or avenue worth exploring. If you already have, somebody incurring some of the cost for something they're doing anyway, and you can piggyback on that, that seems like it's worth asking.
And I came across that in the things that I've read. There was legislation about a dig once law, where if they're building roads to put in the space for the fiber lines, but that legislation didn't go anywhere, unfortunately. But it does make sense and saves time and money in the future. So, but those are all things that we can look at as we go on, I guess, as well. Thank you, James. There's a note from, I think, a member of the public. Where did you get the maps from, and where can we find your data from the UW at?
So I am lucky to work with a very talented geographer who created those maps for us with the FCC data and the federal census data. They are all available to you, though, at the link that I put in the chat. If you open up the data-driven report, that's the very first document that you'll see, or our policy brief. All of the maps down to the census tract level are available. So I hope those are easy to find.
Great, thank you. At the beginning of your presentation, you noted that it was on the screen that there are 14% of households don't have broadband subscription. Is that in the state or the county, or what was that figure from? I missed that.
Yeah, so that's in the state. That's about 300,000 households, which I think is about equivalent to Dane County in total. For Dane County specifically, I think we are not in the highest range. I actually can look this up. For Dane.
So only 14% of the state doesn't have access, or is that a different figure?
So on average, it's going to vary from county to county, but on average, 14% of the state does not have access, right? Dane County, however, is on the lower end of that. It's, I want to say, closer to 5% of the county that does not have access in total. But I can actually pull that figure for you and email it to you and get you the exact data.
And is that based on the FCC maps, or?
That would be based on the census, but I wonder if we could do FCC and census and then compare the difference. I'll dig into that for you and send what I can.
Sure. Because I have a feeling that it's not necessarily that accurate,
right? From
what we've heard from our constituents, where they supposedly have access and don't. So thank you. More information on that would be great.
Sure.
Let's see. The Supervisor Rip has a question for you.
Yeah, I guess I'm still a little confused on the internet versus broadband.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have to be plugged into a phone line.
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody sends me a 90-page document, might as well download it and then go to bed, because next morning I can actually read it.
Mm-hmm.
So what counts as broadband?
So great question. The FCC very specifically says that broadband is 25 megabits per second of download speed, 3 megabytes per second of upload. So that's the 25/3 is sort of the shorthand for that broadband definition. Typically, to have broadband service, that's not going to be something that you could get probably off of a phone line. Typically, you would need fiber, DSL, or cable. So some technologies lend themselves better to broadband than others. I would say fiber is often considered the most preferred technology, but it's also expensive. And for some Wisconsin communities, it's likely not the most feasible option. And so something like fixed wireless might be where you have, this is how my parents get their internet. So there's a grain tower in town. Attached to that grain tower is a fixed wireless signal. So it's casting a very big wireless signal that the home is able to access. And that, I think probably technically they have broadband, but I think what the pandemic has shown us is that even though many of us might have broadband by definition, I know that I do in my home. I'm fortunate to live in a home that does. But with the pandemic, with 2 working professionals online all day, and then if you have a couple of kiddos doing schooling, you probably need higher than 25.3 to make that work. And so that's another, point I try to make with communities is yes, broadband, but also don't hesitate to be thinking about, faster service down the line and what those needs are going to really look like.
Okay. How does one find out what you actually have?
Good question. I would think whoever is your service provider should be able to tell you.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I saw a question here about broadband as a public utility. Should I?
Yes, I was sorry, Joyce. I didn't mean to skip over you. If you wanted to speak on that, or if you would just like her to answer that question.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I'm collecting answers on that question, so I'd be very happy if I could hear comments about that.
Sure. So the policy brief at the link does have a whole 2-pager about, should broadband be a utility? So there was a lot of conversation around this, I want to say in like 2010 to 2015. And ultimately the FCC did reclassify broadband so that it could be regulated as a utility, but it was for reasons that didn't have to do with provision. And ultimately it didn't go anywhere because with the new administration, that language was reversed. So it's become a fairly politicized question. And I think it ultimately comes down to people that think broadband should be a utility, view it as an essential feature of modern life. And people who think that it should come from a competitive market think that there are benefits from a market-based model for broadband provision, and that the competitive market model is actually working well. So through competition, we get lower prices. Through competition, we get more innovation. These are typically the merits of that side of the argument. I would say for a lot of rural communities, the competitive market is a moot point, that a lot of rural areas don't have one provider, let alone 2 to compete. And so these measures, in some places, the measures that are taken to protect competition just don't apply because there's no competition to begin with.
Does anybody have a hybrid, or does that happen?
Yeah, so Singapore has a hybrid. And what they did is said, we're going to make the infrastructure a utility, basically. So they built all of the government or a public entity builds all of the infrastructure. And then once the infrastructure is built, then they lease it out to providers to do service administration and, customer service and all of that.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Are there any additional questions or comments for Dr. Khan? Oh, I missed, I'm sorry. Dina Zentner has a question.
Thank you. I want to say what an excellent and informative presentation, both here and on the Badger Talk. I have a question or comment about the data collection, which I found really interesting. And it seems like a lot of time and energy and effort has been put into that from many credible sources. I found it interesting that the data showed the access to internet, and particularly the broadband 25.3. I've done a rather informal survey in our town of Rutland, and I have found that although the data would likely demonstrate that residents have access to broadband, perhaps the 25.3 or certainly internet services, that even though they have access and they're subscribers, they do not in any way have acceptable or satisfactory service that would help them with virtual learning or telehealth or other necessities. So it would be interesting to me to see some data on people that have internet and fit into this category, but that internet that they have is unacceptable or not satisfactory to meet today's needs.
Right. You make a great point, and I think that there is a need for that data. I would say for how important broadband is and has become, in some ways we know surprisingly little about who has what. And so I agree with you that one of the limitations of the FCC is that it's not going to tell us perfectly who has service, and even among those who have access to service, it's not going to tell us in fine detail the speed that they're able to access. So a community survey, something along those lines, or those speed tests. MLabs that I mentioned is doing speed tests. So that's where, you know, all of us here on the call, we could log in, and they basically, by just logging in and registering our device for a speed test, they would be collecting what our actual service is, and then they're creating maps based on that sort of crowdsourced information. So there are some efforts to get at what you're talking about.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dina. Additional questions. Renee Lauber has a question or comment. Go ahead.
I'm just curious what you can tell us about Wisconsin, statutory limitations and how they compare to other states' restrictions.
Yeah, so from the map, you'll see that Wisconsin has more laws. So we have, I think it is 3 limitations, statutory limitations. So my non-legal summary of state statute is that while it is not explicitly illegal for a municipality to provide service, the statutories make it basically intractable. So for example, you can't compete with an existing provider. So you kind of have to go around to existing providers and say, will you provide service, and hope they say no. The municipality can own but not operate the infrastructure. There have to be certain feasibility studies is my understanding. And anecdotally, the risk is once a community decides that they're going to, fend for themselves and make it work, and they do this study, well, now the provider can see that study and might pop in and take matters into their own hands potentially. I mean, those are sort of unfavorable stories about providers, but it does create this environment where it's just really quite difficult for a municipality in Wisconsin to be able to be in the service provision arena.
And I would note too that that with grants, they're based on public-private partnerships too. So if a municipality were to go on their own, they wouldn't have any grant opportunities.
Right. We are seeing states start to roll back some of these statutory limitations. As I mentioned, I think it's 24 states that have these types of limitations. They might look a little bit differently, and then starting to roll them back kind of as we better understand that these limitations can be linked to limited service provision. I would say it can be difficult to build the political will to make those changes.
Thank you. Further questions? Todd Violante.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your presentation. The one question I had, you mentioned that if 25.3 is sort of the standard or a standard, but that with certain household types, 2 workers with working from home and 2 children in school, that changes very quickly. Are there any standards available that are tied to a demographic or household type like that, that with one employer, one kid, or two employers and three kids? I don't know if that's possible. And
I haven't seen a breakdown like what you're describing, although I think that would be really useful. What I do have in our report, we kind of lay out, okay, here's 0 to 5 megabytes per second. With that speed, you could probably, check your email and browse internet pages. At 25 megabits per second, you could, watch a video, you could do some online gaming, you could do video conferencing, but then you start to see that to have multiple people video conferencing, then the needs increase, clear up to, we go through like what a hospital might need for their network, their sophisticated network needs and that sort of thing. So I can send you the report, but that's the closest I have. If I see something better, I'd be happy to share it with the group.
Great.
thank you.
Thanks. Further questions? Bob Whipperforth.
Yes, I might be wrong on this, but I thought that the city of Sun Prairie had created a utility a number of years ago to provide broadband connection for its residents. And if I remember correctly, Mayor Esser had said that it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. And they've recently partnered with a major internet service provider, and they basically took that utility over. So when you say, governments can do it, it doesn't seem to work very well.
Yeah, so the example of stock I'm not familiar with. It sounds like they might have run into either their own challenges or perhaps statutory challenges if they ultimately handed over control to the provider, because as that can be where the sort of system funnels you, if that makes sense, is that you kind of build this thing, but you can't operate it. I will say there are examples of municipal broadband in Wisconsin, and I should have mentioned this before. Those existed before the laws were made and were essentially grandfathered in.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Any further questions? Otherwise, we are need to move on in our agenda. Dr. Conroy, will you be sending out your presentation, your PowerPoint presentation to us? Would that be possible? And your contact information if we have additional questions then?
Yep, absolutely. I'll share those with you. Again, everything I shared with you today and more is at the link that I provided to the CCED website. And then the very last thing I sent you is a link to this website where they're, speed testing based on people like us volunteering to share their information and making some maps that way. So anyway, it was my pleasure. Thank you all for having me and have a good evening.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, that was a lot of information. We'll move on to item 4, discussion on how does this affect your constituencies. So as this task force was built to encompass many different aspects of our community and county to be represented, we want to hear from you as to why you're here and what you bring to this group, or what makes you excited about broadband. So I will call on you guys all again in kind of the order we did initially, just to keep it a little bit more uniform, I guess. So I will start with Supervisor McGinnity.
Thank you, Chair Radcliffe. Well, I started hearing about the dilemma and the digital divide in a big way in late 2019 and early 2020 as I was running for this seat. And then the pandemic hit, and I heard it, it is the number one thing I hear from the people that I represent, and I, like Supervisor Rip, I have a large rural district of about 125 square miles. So it really excites me to watch government that is working along with and on behalf of our, the people that we represent and bringing together this, what I believe is the solution. So I just can't say enough about how excited I am to be here and to be part of moving Dane County forward on this important issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. Supervisor Rip.
Well, I guess I'm on here because I got appointed. Was told I'm being appointed. I do represent a very rural area, and on that map it was very light, shall we say. So a lot of my area has basically nothing. I've got towns that are about 1,000 people, so it's really hard for them to do much. Give an example, the town of Dane is about 1,000 people and it's got 4 providers. So if you're going to start begging providers to do something, you got to convince 4 of them, and that's almost impossible. So I guess for that expertise, coming from this area, that's probably why I'm mainly here. And I get frustrated because my internet actually doesn't work too bad most days. But if I want to download something, forget it. It takes forever unless it's one page. So, and I can actually watch YouTube about, you know, you get, say, a 5-minute song, I can watch 2 minutes of it before it stops, and then it has to work on it for a while. So it's basically my background.
Thank you, Supervisor Rip. And I appreciate your willingness to be on the task force. I know I reached out to you and asked you, and so I really appreciate you being here because you bring a wealth of knowledge about our county. So thank you. Bill Dickmeyer.
Yes, I guess I was invited because I'm actually work here at Meritor Hospital with Sarah Valencia, who is our director of our population health. But we have I was drawn to the presentation where she talked about the social determinants of health, and I think that is a really it's a big part of what we do as a health system. And I think as most health systems is trying to make sure that we can take care of the people that we want to, that all of you who are participating in our healthcare system can get the care that you need when you need it. And so much more of what we provide now is done electronically, which is both a blessing and a curse in some regards, because I think it does speed care, but I think it also does present challenges for us to have people connect more to their providers, which does require that. So that is kind of one of our big missions, is to try to balance, providing care efficiently and effectively, while at the same time making it available to everyone as well. So that's our kind of goal here. My goal beyond here is to try to see how we can help with that. I think, anecdotally too, we, like many organizations, have sent many of our employees home to work, many of them permanently. And we've, run into those challenges as well of helping to support people who live in rural communities. Some of my, colleagues, especially in IT, even, who have great needs but live in rural communities, and how do we support them to be able to do work effectively? So from a couple different aspects, I guess.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Yep.
Michelle Jensen.
So just a couple of notes that I wrote down. Again, I'm the superintendent at Deerfield Schools, and we are the smallest school in Dane County, off to the far east side. And so before the pandemic, we already were struggling with this, and obviously during the pandemic, it was highlighted more. But I think for us, we really look at this from the school's perspective about equal access. And again, some of what Tessa shared with us really does resonate, right? It's somewhat about demographics, and sometimes it's about about affordable accessibility to some of these features. So, you know, the further out that you get, and when I say that further out, I'm talking about, you know, not very far out of the village, right? All of a sudden I've got families that are trying to decide whether they should be purchasing a satellite because Frontier only went out so far, right? And then Frontier just all of a sudden drops off. And I personally live on the tail end of that Frontier line, and that's a whole nother issue. We pay for speeds that we never get, right? Because that's how it works when you're purchasing. You're purchasing a speed that is promised because you're in that area, but when you do the speed check, you realize you don't even come close to that. So already we're paying an unfair price, but many of our families are also talking about or have in fact invested in satellite, and it's a lot of money up front. Well, pretty soon we've got families who can't afford that, so they're doing without. So I've got students who are staying here after school, sitting in hallways. I've got kids who are working from only a data plan off of their phone and using all of their data. And now more than ever, you know, education is really turned over to being a very much electronic format, right? That we realize that your school day doesn't have to just end in the classroom, but there are so many things that we can access and help kids with once they get home. And it's not a textbook, it's videos. It's being able to model for them in a video recording of how to do that problem when they got home, or to ask them to watch a video in preparation for next day's class. So just the way we educate kids is very different. But then we, again, as Tessa pointed out really nicely in her presentation, we start getting these real big disparities between haves and have-nots, and kids who have access and kids who don't, and do you have a data plan, et cetera. So when I look at this, I think it's a lot to do with accessibility for our families, and how that divide gets bigger when we don't have a level playing field. And so we need to do something different. And this right now, the way it's working is not okay. So I appreciate that this has been brought up and that you've asked me to be a part of it.
Thank you for that, and thanks for being here. Kathy Sutter. Oh, we can't hear you for some reason. It shows you're unmuted though.
I
There you are.
serve on the board for an internet provider, specifically Monhood Telephone Company. And for 5 years, I've received a wonderful education from our monthly meetings. So I'm aware of many of the challenges as an individual, but also from the internet provider end. I was a teleworker for the VA for about 5 years. And I live in the country, and at that time, our internet service was sketchy at best. So I'm aware of the challenges that teleworkers have. I also was an in-home nurse for many years and had my computer with me, but needed internet during the day while I worked. So that also educated me on many challenges. Additionally, we are in agriculture. We are owners of a large farm, and we are using internet more and more in our work. So I'm glad to be part of this. I'm very interested in internet accessibility for all.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. Dina Zentner.
My ultimate goal is to be able to help and assist and inform and educate and do everything that I can to provide internet to our constituents in Rutland. We are like, if you imagine a big patchwork quilt, we have numerous providers. We have fiber optic in several select areas. You know, there's satellite here, but collectively, nothing is working at a standard that's acceptable. And I love being a supervisor because in a small rural area, because I get to know the constituents personally, and I have conducted an informal survey, and I could bring you all to tears by telling you about all of the struggles and strifes and problems that lack of internet reliability has created here in Rutland. So I'm passionate about it, about being part of a solution, of learning about the solution and learning from others. And I hope that, and I know, I should say, I'm hopeful and confident that together we will make a difference and can help our constituents and our towns with the economic impact, as well as the personal issues that they have with this. Thanks.
Thanks for being here. I'm going to skip in the line because I was told Bob Whipperforth has to leave a little early, so I'm going to call on you next, Bob.
Okay, thank you. You know, when you look at the life of the internet, it started out that most people just wanted it for, you know, their own personal reasons. As it has evolved, it has now become a need for people. You know, schools are using it, businesses are using it, agriculture is using it. Everybody uses it and they have a need for it. And when you look at the reliability of the internet, you know, it can be sketchy at best. And in Dane County, you know, with all of our cities and villages, we know there's a hodgepodge of reliability, different speeds in different areas of the county. But when you get out into the rural areas, you know, and then if you have a city or a village, even in a rural setting, you know, it can be pretty unreliable. So I think it's going to take investment from government. I'm thinking state or federal government to really correct this situation. We know that there's either ARPA dollars or infrastructure bills that are being contemplated, that maybe there's some broadband monies available, but it's going to take actually getting the infrastructure into the ground, and either government has to do that or there has to be some type of incentives for the private industry to do it. But this has been talked about for a number of years and there hasn't really been a lot of headway made. So I'm anxious to see how this conversation goes and hopefully we have some good results.
Thank you, Bob. Next, Joyce Tukulski.
Okay, I will try very hard to keep this short. Maybe I can expand it another time, but I've been working for a year on a program called Everyone on Stoughton. I used the Everyone on Madison program as a model for that. I have been the not the only, a tech support volunteer at Stoughton Area Senior Center for several years. That has really inspired me to provide services for older adults, but also to just really assess accessibility in the community too. So during the research for that, I spoke with people at the school district. I tracked down city IT, school district IT. I talked to Madison Tablets to Go to see how they handled their tablets. Madison DaneNet is an old friend of mine. I haven't contacted them yet. And also Madison Maiden provided, I noticed, computers for students early on. I discovered the Public Service Commission, and that phone number is now used at the Senior Center to help people connect with services. Then, you know, I just kept tracking things like the FCC program for reduced internet, and AT&T and Charter both have programs for qualified customers. I embarked on my teaching an assistance at the Senior Center in exactly the wrong way. I was very enthusiastic. I've adopted a whole new way of approaching it. And because mainly of, I would say, the Madison, Everyone on Madison program, I broke my efforts into three parts: providing devices, providing Wi-Fi, and providing training, and how that would work. And so I split my grand plan of everyone on Stoughton into two parts. One is simply computers for older adults. So I focused on that first, and it serves as a prototype. So we now have a lending program of a limited number of tablets. People are required to have one session of training, and we work on the Wi-Fi program. So this, all of this is just fantastic for me, because I can see a lot of ways forward now, especially if we could leverage some grants. So I just thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Joyce, for being here. You definitely have done a lot of work before you got here, so thank you. James Danke.
It's very positive, and it's but it's still remarkable. And I'll share that I've not gotten kicked off this particular session. I'm on the advisory board for the Stoughton Courier Hub. The sessions last an hour, and I just finally, the last one, I just sent an email to the editor saying I've now been kicked off 3 times by poor internet. So I'll just have to hope it works next time. I was cheered and daunted when Tessa noted that there are 47 different grant opportunities. And I know that the town of Dunkirk, and I'm sure that this is true for the town of Rutland, the small rural towns have very, very limited human infrastructure, that they're going to need assistance to try and figure out how to apply for those grants. And without the money to pay people to put in fiber optic cable, ideally, or but other solutions too. But I know that fiber optic is very fast, because I used it in my university and state employment career. But I think if we could pay people you find the money to help pay people to do that, then that would deal with most of my problems here. This is not problems about access, about people who don't have any money to get connected. That's a different question for me. But it's, I really am hoping that this committee will help leverage those grants and provide the instruction to rural municipalities to apply.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, James. I'm glad your internet is cooperating for now. Peter Weil.
Hi, so I'm one of those people who has experienced this firsthand, living 20 miles from Madison, and our internet speed is not as bad as some people's probably, but it's slow enough. I've been working from home for the last year, and my wife's been trying to contact her mother on a daily basis because she's 90 years old, and they want to do FaceTime, regularly. And so it's really hard to do both of those at the same time without the connection crapping out. I think I'm really interested in the notion of dealing with what's really a market failure. I think we need to acknowledge that this has been a market failure. And I think we need to look at something like a hybrid solution. I think government has to be involved. I think relying on maps where the data is provided by providers, it distorts reality, so that we really don't know how many people don't have broadband. We just don't know. We can't rely on those maps. And then here with the smaller towns in our area, I think that we might have to look at something where towns need to group together a little bit to do it on a town by town basis. I live in a Black Earth is a half township, and there's another half township right next to us. And some of the other towns are pretty small and not well populated, and they don't have a lot of resources, much less expertise in this kind of thing. So I think townships may have to group together in order to work with these grants if that's possible. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking at as a possible solution for areas like this. I could go on, but I think I'll stop now and there'll be more conversations later. So.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Todd Violante.
Thank you. I'm here as a designee or representative of the county executive, but it's really, in terms of constituencies, a universal interest across all constituencies of the county, and something that's broadly supported by, all facets of our community. So what we have to bring to the table as a county department, the Planning and Development Department, we touch on a lot of different aspects of this issue that could contribute to some pragmatic problem solving. And we have a familiarity with the geography and the topography of the county, with the many jurisdictions. We work very closely with town jurisdictions. We experience this issue, in a public service context, now working remotely and providing these services, much of it via the internet and via broadband, but also in the decision-making process and access to government and county decision-making through our Zoning and Land Regulation Committee, where we've been holding remote meetings and people access county government via this medium. Majid, one of our outstanding staff who's in the department, who's one of our staff to this task force, works very closely on communication tower proposals. And we have this insight and perspective into the RF aspects of this issue and where they apply. So my interest in representing this perspective is to just contribute to the thinking, apply the resources of our department, and participate in as constructive a way as we can.
Great. Thank you, Todd, for being here. And lastly, but not least, Renee Lauber.
Well, thank you. It's just really great to see so many towns included in this process, and I really appreciate that. So I don't want to, just kind of echo a little bit what they said, but it's a problem of uneven coverage over the county. It's a problem of inaccurate data. It's a problem, like Jim said, of towns having various degrees of employees that can work on this, or sophistication to work on this. Some towns have 5 full-time employees, and Dunkirk has, I think, 0.6 of a clerk. That's already completely, and that's it. Some town halls don't have reliable internet service. So there's just a really wide variety of resources in towns, and there's a wide variety of need out there. Just kind of really want to emphasize that. I really appreciated Supervisor McGinnity's comments, that one of the goals was to help get municipalities data ready, to let them know about grants and the opportunities and all that. And I think that, there's just some towns out there that just do not have the staff to even take this on, but the need is still there.
Yes, very good points, and thank you. And I forgot that I didn't go and say why I'm here. So basically, Supervisor McGinnity reached out to me back before the pandemic even, about hearing from people in her communities that lacked broadband access. And I had heard that from some of mine as well. So we started looking into it further, and there's so many facets and aspects to broadband coverage. And I think, as we've heard from all of you, that's why you're all here, because we were touching on every little bit of it, not knowing where to go. And so we wanted to help lighten the load. Many hands make light work, I think is the right saying. So that's how we got to this point, and I really appreciate all of your perspectives and for being here. So that brings us to the next topic. How can the task force help address gaps due to incomplete infrastructure and or cost for services? There's a item attached to the agenda that Representative Beth Myers had provided to us when she met with Supervisor McGinnity and myself. So I really want to thank her for providing this for us and meeting with us. She was on the governor's task force, and I found it interesting when I went through this that a lot of these things we saw in the presentation today as well. So if there are any questions about this or comments that you have, I'd love to discuss it a little bit. We have a few minutes to go over it if you'd like. Otherwise, I think her policy recommendations noted at the bottom of page 1 are things that I think the task force will be working towards and on as we go throughout this year. So I'll just pause for a minute if you have any desire to have a question or comment, and put it in the chat box. All right. And I guess it's pretty self-explanatory, but if there are questions, you can always reach out and let us know as we go along. Next item 6 is the upcoming presentations. Lauren, can you put that on the screen? All right, so as we go along these next meetings, these next months, we'll be looking at funding sources in the county's authority, success stories from municipalities in our county that have applied for grants, and a presentation from the Public Service Commission regarding what they're looking for in grant submissions. And so that gives us an idea of what information we need to gather as a task force or to help municipalities to gather. We'll be looking at technology options, discussion of rural and urban issues, land use and mapping, digital equity, public engagement, and sharing information about broadband with the public. In the resolution that created the task force, we'll also have 2 public hearings to hear from residents and maybe about the difficulties that they've had or what they'd like to see going forward. And this list isn't in order, so it may change around, but we'd also like to hear if there's specific things that you'd like to discuss that maybe isn't on this list, or things that we should look into further. And you don't have to come up with it today either. If we go along and you hear of something that sounds interesting, you can always reach out to Lauren or Sharon, myself, or Supervisor McGinnity as well. So with that, I'll just pause a moment to give anybody an opportunity to note a comment or question in the chat box. At our next meeting, I think we will be hearing about county funding, county's authority in funding, and funding sources that may be available. Yes, Todd Violante has a question, comment.
Thank you, Chair Ratcliffe. One thing, it may be built into the land use and mapping, but one of the fundamental pieces that it would be good to know is really where the service exists and where the vulnerabilities are. I know we have the PSC source data, but that might be something, a presentation or some discussion, and actually being able to see where these areas are in maybe a little more detail if possible. Maybe that's in the land use and mapping section, but just wanted that's one piece of it that's really been on my mind.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I think it might be that's something we're looking at too, as far as the outreach to the community to understand where the needs are, because we all know the maps aren't correct. And so we need to figure out how we can make them more accurate for the grant application. Because if an area doesn't have service, but coverage provider says it does, I think they're less likely to get the grant then based on that. So that's something that we'd like this task force to address as well. So thank you. Yes, James Danke. I like to call on the people if you put a comment in there. So sorry to catch you off guard there.
I'd like to hear from providers. Maybe someone who is a staff person here could just simply ask them how much it costs to lay fiber optic. I mean, it's not something I've ever purchased or planned to, but it's getting those costs, I think, would help facilitate our discussions.
Great. Yes, good point. Thank you so much. That would be interesting to know. And then Joyce Tukalski.
Sorry. Yeah, I guess I am at a point where I've looked at the census data and I have the 2019 information about Stoughton and an idea about the Stoughton area. I'm wondering about surveys, if maybe just find out if there are more reliable results from surveys, or if I should undertake a survey myself.
Great, yes. And I think that is something that is part of that we're hoping to do maybe with UW Extension's help, is the survey aspect, and that we'll look into more in the coming months, because I think that is important to figure out who has coverage where. Is that the type of survey, or is there some other aspect?
Right, because right now, like say in the city of Stoughton, the census data would say that we have 278 households who don't have an internet subscription. And I don't know if I should just try to verify that if it's something we're not sure about, or if I should go in a completely different direction. What would be useful, especially to the whole group, not just my realm or the things I know about so far.
Right. Those are good points. Thank you for bringing that up. Let's see. Jeff is not in our task force. I think he might be with a member watching. So, but he does note that a survey to understand the areas that need service or updated service and what level of service they have or need. So thank you for that comment. Supervisor McGinnity with a comment.
Thank you, Chair Radcliffe. I just wanted to say, in terms of the data points, I think what we're looking at is first seeing what is necessary, for the grants that are available, and then also partnering and learning like how else this data has been collected, so that we're not recreating, a survey or, kind of seeing what's out there. But I do really see this task force, heading up, getting that accurate data, however it is we can do that. So it sounds like a lot of us are on the same page, and I'm just pleased to hear that. So thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor McGinnity. All right, any further comments or questions about this? about our future presentations and kind of the direction we're going on the task force. We haven't taken all of the issues, so we've left ourselves a little bit of room. Maybe. Okay, so you can, thank you, Lauren. Item G, then we're on future meeting items and dates. Our next meeting then will be Thursday, August 5th at 9 a.m., which will be our regular meeting schedule going forward. I'm glad that you were all able to accommodate this meeting to get us kicked off here on a Tuesday afternoon. And we'll try to keep the meetings to 2 hours, 2-hour blocks. We've done a pretty good job so far this afternoon. That brings us then to H, public comment on items not on the agenda. And I think we do have a registrant then.
I've just promoted Jeff Schuman.
Great. Thank you. Jeff, you have 3 minutes to speak. And you're on mute.
Excuse me. I'm sorry.
There you go. You have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jeff Schuman. Many of you know me and my family. Being 7th generation of Dane County. I first want to emphasize that I'm also working with the State of Wisconsin Broadband Commission as well. I hear the same arguments that you have with rural broadband as I hear within the state on a monthly basis as well. I represent a group of companies. My business here in DeForest, Wisconsin is Manhattan Digital. We do satellite work, heavily satellite for the last 40 years. We're also in the satellite antenna business. So any questions about satellite broadband, I can answer those along with most of your questions on that survey. Within our group, we have vast amount of experience, decades, 2 of the best people in wireless and fiber installation with crews available. We work with major companies as in Cisco and Fujitsu, and along with American Tower, which is prominent in Dane County as well. We also do a lot of MDU, so IoT. The mapping that I'm seeing disagrees with many of them that I've seen. The best I've seen so far is from the NTIA. For information, the NTIA and the FCC are finally getting together and working out for better map solutions because they are underserved in that area. So I'm suggesting to each area that needs broadband to do those surveys with their people and coming up with an idea who has service, who's underserved, who needs better service. Our business will combine both wireless under 5G, Wi-Fi and wireless, and also fiber. And we can do it all under one area. So we have vast experience in these areas. And we can put the towers where needed, if need be. But we also identify the FCC's tower standards and broadcast versus the state of Wisconsin, which exceeds the power levels by the FCC, 1/4 mile away from the nearest resident. So our basic foundation is to start in the rural areas, work with the commission and the communities of rural Dane County, formulate a plan to serve the best areas, moving from the rural areas to the inwards. Where in the insert in the Madison areas, we can provide redundancy, Wi-Fi, and also the 5G service as well, where needed, if needed, for redundant services, along with mobile Wi-Fi for mobile users. So basically all that coming together, and as Peter kind of hit the nail, is the lack of competition, which is what's the problem in this country.
Jeff, you're at 3 minutes.
I'm sorry. So
Sorry.
I guess I'm done. So I like to work with the commission in the future. I will be on meetings at all times and I'm available. I'll provide with you through the Dane County as well, my information. I've worked with Todd, I've talked with Todd a couple times, and I think we just need access to the access of the Dane County assets to put these towers on, which keeps the system more affordable. The townships don't have to worry about grants. We do all the grants, but we need to know the addresses.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yes.
All right, Lauren, are there any other registrant, or I'm sorry, are there any questions for Jeff before we let him go? I'm not seeing any. Thank you for your comments, Jeff. Next, Lauren, are there any other registrants?
There were no more registrants.
Thank you. That brings us then to item I, such other business as allowed by law. And item J, adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Thank you, Joyce. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, James. A motion and a second. And in the digital world, if there is an objection, let me know. Otherwise, we are adjourned.